Hey folks, and welcome to another episode of Crit Hit Reviews with your host, Arlian. On this week's show, I'll be chatting about Crimson Keep, a first-person hack-and-slash title Merge Games provided me a review copy for. But did this game manage to get my blood pumping, or would you be better off keeping away? So, in the lore department, Crimson Keep follows the story of a generic protagonist exiled to the heart of a ruined kingdom. While they're in the neighborhood, they engage in a quest to liberate the heck out of said desolate landscape by slaying its demonic overlord, Mara. That said, it wasn't by playing the game I found these particular details, as I found it to be an extremely story-light experience. Rather, the game's introductory lore dumps are found on its Steam page and in the introductory video. In the game itself, my experiences at finding out more about its story were limited to a bony boy at a campfire who said something different every time I entered a new game, and a ghost who bemoaned her unfortunate situation. That was about that. My attempts at discovering if there was deeper lore hidden in the guts of the game hit, some rather unfortunate and literal dead ends. The reason for that particular dead end is fundamentally tied to Crimson Keep's gameplay loop. So, as I mentioned in the intro, this particular title is a hack and slash of the randomized RPG variety. You get 3 character classes you can choose between, those being a melee-oriented barbarian, a magic-oriented witch, and the woefully underwhelming dweller. The first 2 classes are primarily differentiated by their abilities, a set of abilities you can choose from upon hitting the 1st, 4th, and 7th level. You start at 0, by the way. Mind you, these aren't spammable abilities, so your core gameplay rotation is still going to be primarily stabbing things while they slowly charge up the abilities with kills. But they do provide some alternatives to your kit. Unfortunately, these really are the main differences between the 2 classes, as the only other thing you can acquire as you level are perks, a set of randomly selective passive abilities you can choose between, which don't necessarily complement your character or their abilities, which you gain at every level that you don't gain an ability. And a pretty egregious example of this was gaining wand damage as the fighter after a level of melee damage. It was underwhelming in and of itself, but even more so because I hadn't even found a wand throughout that entire playthrough. And it also sort of doesn't help because you're not really able to plan around a long-term strategy for your skill setup since the entire skill tree ends up being random. And adding further injury to insult, not every option the game offers you when leveling is even selectable at first, as a number of the abilities and passives are tied to acquiring some of the game's achievements. Not that they even tell you which ones, which means trying to figure out if you need to, get perfects on bosses, smash an arbitrarily large amount of barrels, or throw yourself in the midst of spike traps and die to gain access to a more rounded out kit, at best feels frustrating and lackluster. The Dweller, on the other hand, is just an incredibly gimped version of the other classes, lacking any sort of passive or active ability. In fact, he can't even level, and starts with less than half the health of the other options, amounting to what is essentially a masochistic hard mode for the game. I mean, yes, they're still able to engage in combat fairly adeptly, given that your options basically amount to stab, block, and dodge, or potentially use a weapon ability if you're not using a shield, but given their overall limited offensive abilities and survivability, the odds are you're just going to end up playing a bit more cautiously. Though, I mean, at least the near-death status that happens when you hit 0 health means you can't just be one-shot, as the game's at least kind enough to give you one last chance at finding a safe place and recovering your health. Unless you drop in lava, then you're just dead. Not that I'd actually recommend taking your time, given that there's also a starvation system. And I mean, yes, being well-fed can actually work in your favor, given that it grants you bonus max health. But there's been a number of my unfortunate playthroughs where a search through stage provided me literally 0 chunks of food to nom on, eventually resulting in my max health decreasing before I finally succumbed to damage over time from being a starving noodle. And no, you'll need to manually keep on top of checking your hunger in the menu, since there's no starvation meter or the like to helpfully alert you to how screwed or well fed you are in the HUD. Also, honestly, the random generation in the game left a lot to desire for me, really, given the fact that while the dungeons were randomly generated, within less than an hour I found myself running through very similar set pieces over and over again, with some of them even being found repeatedly in the same stage. Sure, this does make the game a bit more labyrinthine, especially given that there isn't an in-game map, but it also makes for some fairly monotonous level design. The gameplay element that makes this particular facet of things at least tolerable is that you have some unlimited use of chalk that you can use to mark down where you've gone before, which also really sort of went well with the whole you don't have a map thing. Not that exploring was really all that rewarding. Like, yes, I wanted to know where food stuff was, so I wouldn't die an ignoble death. And getting levels would hopefully give me an assortment of perks to make delving in further less painful. But the actual assortment of equipment that I ended up finding across a level was fairly samey, with the main difference between the various odds and ends of gears I found being whether or not it gave more health.
Which was then made worse by the fact that I had limited inventory space, and there was a general lack of vendors whom I could use to offload my dungeon detritus or get better things with.
Though, maybe it was the fact that I also acquired some incredibly junky drops from both the death trap of a challenge room I'd stumbled into, thanks for the rags, as well as the boss and his personal drops. Thank you for 2 pairs of sandals. And speaking of the bosses, the first boss was always the same, a bigger than average ogre who had a large amount of health, and who I literally killed by circle strafing and smacking him with a sword until his health drained. With some backwards and side dodges thrown in for fun. Which, to be fair, really summed up all of the game's combat, given that I didn't have much in the way of options. It was a fairly underwhelming experience.
And I have no words for having just forced player death as a mechanic for progression. I'm gonna say a roguelike that basically has advancement hinging on a player ending their current run and dying arbitrarily to progress more is not really all that enjoyable. Just saying.
Now, I didn't actually mind Crimson Keep when it came to the sound department. Certainly, there were instances of the voice acting being a bit hammy, but I found that weirdly charming. Except for the game over screen. That gets tired fast. Now, the ambient music was alright as well, though it admittedly all started to blur together for me after a bit, and there was nothing that actually stood out for me after I put the game down. Despite having the particularly edge-tastic name of Crimson Keep, I found myself looking at a lot of creature designs and being like, this thing is friggin' cute in the ugliest way possible for a lot of the monsters. Well, except for the zombies, which were just sort of moist, sticky looking, which made them the antithesis to cute. That said, the dungeons themselves felt far more forgettable graphically, and aside from a few set pieces, I found a lot of the experience to be a bit samey in dungeon design, as I mentioned earlier. What this boils down to is that ultimately, I can't really say I enjoyed my time with Crimson Keep, as the various aspects of randomness inherent in its system didn't really seem to do it any sort of favors. Due to their random perks, the classes felt unreliable and weird at best. I mean, at least the Dweller was honest about its intent to see you die, and the fact that you were punished by having options available to you limited by virtue of having not achieved some arbitrary achievement you don't even get to find out about was unpleasant. Further insult to injury was the manner in which the loot drops and inventory system were at once boring, unreliable, and punishing, and it made the inevitable death by starvation feel both supremely unfair, not only because RNGs has decided not to litter a level with any food, but also because there was the entire possibility that every single slot where food could go in your inventory would be cluttered with gear. Also, as I mentioned earlier, the randomly generated levels still managed to be utterly monotonous, and combat was repetitive and boring. I wouldn't even recommend this game to die-hard fans of hack-and-slash games, at least in its current state, and thus rated as a fail. Really, the best thing I have to say for it is at least it doesn't crash or seem all that buggy.
Oh. Right. Thanks, Mr. Editor. Well, between that and the fact that the soul door mechanic is literally giving me cancer, I guess this gets to be our first epic fail in a long while. Thanks for that.
And this brings this episode to an end, so I'd like to thank you folks for both tuning in and sticking till the end. Whether you agree or disagree with my thoughts, I'd love to hear from you folks in the comments, and for those interested in more indie reviews or interviews with the developers, feel free to hit the subscribe button and, the bell icon so you get notified when we have a new release. Lastly, and this is also in part from Lovey, our community manager, join our Discord, link in the description and in the banner, so you can become a part of our community. Really, it's sort of cozy. Like a cabin in the woods that doesn't have serial murderers. Anywho, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.